in the process of doing this work. So I just want to explicitly thank that has been offered, to keep challenging ourselves, keep holding ourselves accountable to seeing patterns of white supremacy, patterns of colonialization, patterns that we're still trying to break out of, even present in these spaces. And it's critical that we keep naming them, it's critical that we keep challenging them, and it's critical that we keep living into liberation. So I just want to express some gratitude for that. And also express some gratitude for Rabbi Mordechai Liebling, who's joining us in this next session, because Rabbi Mordechai for me is someone who does just keep stepping further into liberation through action. He answered the clergy call to in Ferguson, Standing Rock, Charlottesville, has answered that call many times by stepping forward and putting his body and his beliefs in on the line. He's also the founder and director of the Social Justice Organizing Program at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And I could read more from this bio, but mostly I'm excited to let Rabbi Liebling speak for himself, and excited to step into this circle with you all. Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks everybody for being here, and thank you Lena and Francisco for organizing this. It's the first liberation theology gathering that I know of anywhere in the Philadelphia area. So really, thank you very much for putting this together. At the moment, I'm acutely aware that I'm the third old white man in the row to speak. But if you look at the program, I'm the last one. So, it is my custom to always thank the indigenous people of the area, so I do thank the Lenape people for caring for this land for so many years and still caring for it. And the way I like to begin is actually to try to enter into a deep time for a moment. So if we could all stand, please. And we're going to invoke the beings of 3 times. It's a practice that I'm sure Mark knows. I learned from my teacher, Joanna Macy. So first, we're going to honor those who came before us. So think in your heart mind, of all those people whose shoulders you stand on. People you may have known or may have never known. People who may have lived 10 years ago or 1,000 years ago or more. So bring those people's energy into this room. Bring them into your heart. Because it is only on their merit that we are able to do this work now. And if you feel comfortable, say out loud some of the names of the people you're bringing in. If not, say them quietly in your heart. But don't wait for other folks. Just say aloud names that mean something to you. Thank you, ancestors. We hope to honor your work. We hope to honor your spirit. And we greatly appreciate all that you have done to make what we do possible. And now let's welcome in all of our comrades, our sisters and brothers, and others around the world right now who are alive, because we can't do any of this work by ourselves. We can only do this work with others. We depend on them the way they depend on us. So now in your hearts, in your heart-mind, bring in their energy, bring in your consciousness and awareness of all the people that you do the work with. And again, if you're comfortable saying your names out loud, please do, not just say them in words. We honor all our comrades and allies, friends and relatives in the world who allow us to do the work that we do, and we invite your energy into this room now to help us think and help us move forward. And now we invite in all those whose names we do not know, all of the people for whose sake we do this work. We do this work for the sake of our children, our children's children, nieces, nephews, all of the people who are not born yet, who we hope will come into the world and hope will come into a world of justice, a world of sustainability, blue skies, clean water, and justice. So now welcome in all of the beings for whose sake we do the work. And may all our thoughts and work serve you well. Be seated. So for the next, we're here till about 6 or so, somewhere around the middle. I'll check in and see if we need a bio break for a few minutes. And this will be a combination of me talking a little, us talking as a group, as a whole, and a fair amount of time of people talking to each other. And I'm going to look at some of the Torah traditions that we draw on for liberation theology. But what I'd like you to do first, I would like you to don't get up. Turn to a partner. Find a partner. Who does not have a partner? Does everyone have? Who does not have a partner? Okay. So this is. Wait, I'm going to time you. And one person will speak, and then the other person will listen. It's really not as much of a conversation as a listening. So one person will speak, and then the other person will listen, and at the end of 3 minutes, I will call time, and you will switch. Okay? And this is something called an open sentence. And this is, I would like you to be, everybody will begin with this phrase. And then you'll finish a sentence in the paragraph, and when you're finished with that thought, you will return to it. So the phrase is, I am grateful that my faith tradition guides my work for justice by. I am grateful that my faith tradition guides or inspires my work for justice by. And if you don't have a faith tradition that you feel that you call on, you could use the word God or Spirit, whatever word works for you in there. So I am grateful that my faith tradition guides my work for justice by. The person who will go first is the person with the shorter hair in the So shorter hair is person A, and person A, please begin with the phrase, I am grateful that my faith tradition guides my work for justice by, and person B will just listen, and please begin. Thank you, partner. Let's just take a few minutes for a few people to perhaps share. Maybe someone who hasn't spoken to the whole group yet today could share something that came up for you when you were speaking. Maybe even something that surprised you that you said.
go.
I think I was very surprised that after hearing my partner speak, that the first thing I wanted to do was sort of change. I'm grateful for my faith traditions. I'm grateful for my cultural traditions because I feel I'm still working through a lot of issues around what faith traditions are of mine. I feel like, especially someone from the Caribbean, the faith issues that a lot of people hold dear are not ours inherently. And so, as such, I can't say faith tradition.
Other folks?
I'll go. I was a little surprised at my answer too. I grew up kind of in the more evangelical Christian tradition. My parents were missionaries. And so what I was kind of startled by was kind of my wanting to almost reclaim some of that, even as I've kind of let go of a lot of those things. But so like things like a prayer life or like having the importance of having a relationship with God and with Jesus in particular, and kind of and Jesus being this kind of the head, this person that we're called to follow, and sort of how radical that really is, even though it wasn't that way necessarily growing up. So anyway, I was surprised at my answer.
Anyone else? Not necessarily something that surprised you, but something that arose.
I just found myself talking about how structurally and institutionally my faith tradition supports social justice. And just kind of feeling good about that it really is, organized. Really is. Really very nice.
You know what, I forgot to ask people to say their names first, because we don't know everybody's name. Can we just say your name?
Johanna.
Kate.
I'm Jessica. So for me, I wanted to share a little bit about my journey. This past year, I joined the church. I live in the Bronx. I'm a native Philly person. I'm Philly Rican. I'm Puerto Rican from Philadelphia. And so for me, I grew up Catholic, and it was very oppressive, especially as a queer person. And I've been involved with social justice since I was a teenager. Philadelphia, we're leftists, it's in our water, right? So for most people, I believe. So I left Catholicism, and I very much felt like it was oppressive being and a person who has African and indigenous blood. I just felt like that I can't connect with that, And so I have some earth-based practices. Like I was initiated into basically Puerto Rican Afro spirituality, you can say. I was initiated into that, so I practice that sometimes. But I found a church where I was able to really connect with my relationship to Jesus, like as a radical, revolutionary, connecting to what the real church was prior to the Gospels that have been eliminated into the Bible. That the Bible we see today is used as an oppressive vehicle, and even like I had a friend. I was very also involved with Jewish community at one point. I never went through that process, but that also really spoke to me, like learning about the Maccabees and all the various stories. Like really, I was like, wow, like I was able to find inspiration. Like, how is it that this group is able to have like a cultural and also spiritual practice? But for me, as like Afro-Taina, that doesn't necessarily always feel connected because what I'm connected to is considered oppressive or like something that I need to hide. But so I just want to share that like this past year, I've really been able to find a faith-based community that has really supported me, and I think like with that, it's really allowed me to bring the work that I do in the world to another level, knowing that I'm an instrument of God, and that's given me a lot of peace. So that's like something that I was sharing here with my folks, and I felt called to share with the room.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
When you posted that question, the things that came to mind was my experience, within the Catholic Church, being part of a community ecclesial base, completely different to many other people's experience of what, an organized, large institution is. It was amazing because for me, the meaning of liberation, the meaning of being a community was there, by people putting their faith into action in every single second of their life, individually and with a very collective mindset of we are doing this together. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks everybody. So the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and sometimes it's called all of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, but certainly the Torah, the first 5 books, I read and understand as the collective, is the oral tradition of the indigenous people of that area. So the Torah is really the product of the wisdom of the indigenous people who lived in that place at that time, and it was their oral tradition that was written down over centuries that eventually becomes the Torah, that becomes the Hebrew Bible. So there's a lot of earth wisdom in the Torah because it comes from a land-based people. So I find it helpful to read it that way, but it's also important to understand that it's particular in its own way because it's the experiences of a particular set of people in a particular place. And Mark talked earlier about the need or having a meta story, a big story, and how the big story guides our lives. And they created a big story, a meta story that was in some ways derived from previous cultures and civilizations. And the meta story that they developed about God creating the world and then the Exodus became the meta story for most of Western civilization. So it became a pretty important meta story that's been used and abused in many ways, and it certainly has come to serve oppressive cultures for the last hundreds of years, if not thousands, a couple of thousand years. So, as Will was saying earlier, we have to be able to redeem or re-look at some of the stories that were told and understand them. So, one of the things that I think is that we need to have a larger meta story for the earth itself. We need to have, we have come ever since we have that iconic photo of the earth floating in space. We have some better understanding of our interconnection and living in one world. So I believe our challenge is to have a meta story that encompasses and affirms the interconnectedness of all humanity, while allows each of us to affirm our own culture's individual stories, that we have whatever our faith tradition, cultural tradition is, and there are hundreds, that we need to figure out a way that they can fit in that container of a meta story so that our universalism, our connectedness is affirmed, while the genius of our own particular culture is affirmed as well. And I think that's kind of the challenge we have, and oddly enough, I think science and evolution actually is the most helpful there to think about whether it's the Big Bang or the story of evolution. That meta story is something which encompasses all of us, really is rooted in Earth, is our connection to the Earth, our connection to the cosmos. And is one of radical equality. We all descended from the same persons. So perhaps I think the challenge of our generation is to be able to, the Journey of the Universe folks that Mark mentioned earlier, they're trying to do that in some way. So our challenge is to somehow sacralize that meta story of the universe, of us all being together, at the same time that we can place our own particular traditions in that. So the biblical creation story is a story for some set of people. It's not the story for everybody. And those of us who choose to believe that, or believe that in some metaphorical way, that's fine. But what I would like to, the piece I'd like to lift out of, particularly out of the creation story, and in the Jewish tradition, some of you may know, we have a cycle of reading the Torah the entire year, and we just began that cycle. So last Saturday we read the story of Genesis, creation, and tomorrow we will read the story of Noah, and the week after that we will read the story of Abraham. So in the Jewish world, we are very much in the midst of the creation and Noah stories and all that entails. So last Saturday, we read the story about the Garden of Eden, and we and one of the key words that relate to justice in that story is the Hebrew word ayeka, where God says to Adam, after, actually the text says it to Adam, not Adam and Eve, but let's see, he says it to both of them. God says it to both of them in the story, that where are you after they eat of the apple and they're ashamed? Ayeka, where are you? And they're trying to hide. So ayeka is the call in the Bible to personal responsibility. And we have ayeka in the text several times, which is God calling out to the individual, ayeka, where are you? So the Bible, the Torah, is an interesting balance of individual responsibility and group identity, group responsibility. I think as Will said this morning, think about the Ten Commandments as a communal obligation, not an individual obligation. In the Bible, in the Torah, there is no such thing as individual salvation. It doesn't exist. That's a concept that comes way later. It's only about the group. Yeah, it's only about the group. So that there's a mix. The ayeka is the call to the individual. And many other places in Torah, it is about what the group is supposed to do. So I think that the ayeka piece is, in terms of liberation theology, an important question. It is calling you to take responsibility for what is happening in the moment. No one of us can ever evade that responsibility. Abraham Joshua Heschel has a famous line that in a society, not everyone is guilty, but everyone is responsible. Right? So ayeka is the call to responsibility. So now I would like you to turn to a different partner now. Maybe turn the other way. Okay?
Were you shut down earlier? Sorry.
Well, you guys. Here's the question. Okay, so everybody have a partner?
I don't think I need one.
Okay. Great. Everybody have a partner now? Raise your hand if you do not have a partner.
I think I don't.
Okay, come over here. Excuse me.
Okay, Lena and Jonathan, you guys, did you raise your hand? Okay. You can talk to both switch. You know what? You know I have partners. I'll do it. Okay. So this is the question. Okay, I'd like you to tell a story, a true story, of when you answered the call ayeka. A time when you answered the call for justice, for freedom, for responsibility. A time when you acted, when you heard God's voice within you, or a voice within you calling you to responsibility to act. And if you really can't think of one, make it up of a time that you wish you had done that. So, just to switch it up, this time the person with the longer hair will begin. That's time. Thank you, partner. Thank you. And now, look around the room, and you are in a room full of people who answer that call. Right? So look around in gratitude, knowing that you're not alone, that there are other people in the world who share your concerns and share your passion and share your commitment and are willing to answer the call. Take that in. And then the other thing we learned in that creation story is that everyone is created in the image of God. Right? It's B'Tselem Elohim is the Hebrew. So everybody is in the image of God, which is the basis, at least in the West, for a human rights tradition. Right? Human rights tradition is that we're all in God's image. So one of the Jewish laws is that you can't, if someone is killed or someone is hung, the body can't be left alone because that's a desecration of God's name, because we're all created in the image of God. So that each of us is in that image, and from there we can derive a whole theory and practice of equality, of non-hierarchy, and of human rights. So that's a story that we need to preserve. You know, if we tell that story that we are, you know, the composite of atoms and molecules that are 14 billion years old, and all we are is stardust, that's also sacred, because we are in the image of the cosmos, right? We all come out of the Big Bang. We all come out of the sacred beginning of the universe, right? So we can look at each other as representations of, or manifestations of, the sacred beginnings of the universe, which is also a way to ground our human rights. The teacher Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who looks at this set of stories in the beginning of the Bible as sort of the evolution of moral responsibility. The first Hayeka is to Adam and Eve, and they kind of deny personal responsibility and have to grow from that. The second one is to Cain, right? So he denies moral responsibility, right? I'm not responsible for my brother, right? He denies, so you have to take, so we learn from that, you have to take moral, first individual, then moral responsibility, and then the next one is really to Noah, which is what we're going to read tomorrow, and Noah takes responsibility for himself, but not for the collective. He saves his own family, doesn't save anybody else. any other people. It saved the animals, which is good. Saved the animals, we didn't save the people. So from Noah we learn the importance of collective responsibility. But the interesting thing about that story is when and the covenant in that story ends with the rainbow covenant that, that God makes. But if you look at it carefully, the rainbow covenant is not made with humans. It's made with all of creation. It's made with the animals and the trees and the plants and the seas and the fishes as well as people. And it's clear that that is a unity, that we all have to be responsible for each other. That early in the Bible, I think the interdependence becomes clearer, is clearer, and becomes more obfuscated over time. And I think that's certainly what's happened a lot in the West, is that our interdependence and our connection to the earth has faded away. And I won't go into how I think the biblical tradition is in part responsible for that, but I think so. The other piece I want to talk about for a moment is the Exodus story. Certainly, classical liberation theology has held up the Exodus story as the paradigm for liberation. And this is my brand new t-shirt that I'm wearing here for the first time. Right? Resisting tyrant since Pharaoh. So, that's the Exodus tradition. But the Exodus tradition has its problems because it ends in Joshua. We don't tell the Joshua story as much as we tell the Exodus story, which is the story of conquest and colonialism. You can't tell the Exodus story with any kind of authenticity these days unless you're going to tell a Joshua story, right? So it's a problematic story. The other piece that's problematic about that story is there's not a whole lot of human agency in there, right? Yeah. We know that we're not going to bring about liberation, freedom, unless we do it collectively, unless we do it together. There's a little bit of magic in the Exodus story, right? But it ain't going to happen through magic. So it means that we have to organize and do it collectively. So that makes that paradigm a problem. We have to think about what is going to be the liberation story that is a story that is about collective action, about organizing, about empowering, and that the most affected people will be in the front. That's a story that we need to create. We need to co-create. I think that the real thing that I'm trying to say about all of it is that we are in a time where collectively we need to co-create our liberation theology that can be a big story. It is the job of our generations alive now to co-create that story while we are drawing on the wisdom of our ancestors. We are also living in a different moment in time. And we do have the amazing ability to draw on the wisdom of multiple there is more ability right now in the world to draw on the wisdom of multiple traditions than there ever has been in the history of humanity. Because we do live in the global village. We can learn from each other's from each other's traditions and pasts. And the piece of the Exodus story that I want to lift up at the moment is the burning bush story. Okay? So the burning bush story is where God reveals God's name to Moses. And the Hebrew is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be, is the Hebrew translation of that, the English translation of the Hebrew. I'm going to, in a few minutes, pass out some text, and we'll actually do some study together. But let me just preface that by saying, so the text we're going to look at was a little prefaced by a contemporary theologian named Art Green, who's been an important teacher to me, and then another contemporary theologian named Michael Lerner, who is important to me. When I had a conversation with Cornel West once, and I asked him about who he thought important contemporary Jewish theologians were, and the first person he said was Michael Lerner. He thought that Michael was, so I thought that was a pretty good endorsement. So we'll look at a piece of text from Michael in a minute that is about the tension between being and becoming. Right? So there is the set of wisdom that we have to just be, and there is the set of wisdom that says we have to change the world to the way it ought to be. Right? And lots of times we live in that tension of being, acceptance, this is the way the world is, and this is the way the world needs to be. And sometimes we have created a false dichotomy between spirit and ethics, or religion and politics, which religion is just supposedly just being and accepting grace and being with God, and politics is changing the world the way it ought to be. And the reading we're going to look at is talking about how that's a false dichotomy. Okay? So we'll do this in sort of traditional Jewish style, which means, again, finding a partner. This time, feel free to sort of get up and find a partner. You can be in twos or threes. Traditionally, when it's done, you read the passage out loud, but if you don't want to read the passage out loud, that's fine. But it's a this is a conversation, and in traditional Jewish learning, it is okay to challenge the suppositions of what your partner is saying in a careful and a loving way, but it's about trying to dig and uncover what the text means. It's not about middle class niceness.
Well,
it's about what does this really mean, and let's really challenge each other to find out what it really means. Okay? So I'm going to pass out. We're just going to be nice. Or at least respectful. It's about being. It's not about being nice. It's about being respectful. That's what it's about. So I'm going to pass out these texts. So you'll have about 15 minutes so in either twos or threes, really grapple with this text about what they mean about being and becoming, accepting and acting the world as it is, the world as it ought to be, and what God's role, your understanding of how you relate to God in that way.
Say that again.
Your understanding what God is telling you about being and becoming. We have about 15 minutes.
As you were talking, it occurred to me that there's and I'm drawing a blank on the name, an indigenous community here in the States, when they're doing the tapestry and quilting, they intentionally sew a flaw in it, and it's not perfect until the flaw is there. And it's not, and they approach their way of looking at one another, that you're not perfect until you can acknowledge the flaws that exist. So you're not, and they don't put them up for sale or out unless the flaw is exposed, unless you can see the flaw. So they deliberately. Is it not a book?
Oh, there's lots and lots of traditions.
Yeah.
The Japanese with the gold in the pottery, kind of the same thing. Like something cracks, and it becomes more valuable when it has to be very cracked.
Great, thank you. So let's stay with Exodus for another moment here. So I had a teacher who taught me that the miracle of Sinai was human beings coming together to found a society based on justice. That nothing to do with revelation, but that the idea that people would create a society whose guiding principle was justice, that was the miracle. So what is that? There are some people in the Jewish world, I among them, who believe that what Will would teach as Sabbath economics, or other of us would call the Jubilee Cycle, is really the heart of the Torah. And that is the entire reason the Torah was written. If you talk about creating a society based on justice, then the principles of justice we find in the Jubilee Cycle. Let me remind you what the Jubilee Cycle is for a moment, or the way at least we talk about it, Sabbath economics. First is the idea of you rest on the seventh day. That every worker, every animal gets to rest. Nobody has to work all the time, not even your animal. That one day a week, you celebrate. You really celebrate being alive. You celebrate your community. You celebrate your connections to God, to creation, to community, to other beings. So, and you don't use money. The seventh, maybe the most radical act we can do in this culture is not use money for a day. Right? That's a major attack on capitalism, refusing to use money for a day. So Sabbath economics begins with not using money for a day, and a day of absolute and complete rest for humans and animals. So some really interesting, they used to go nuts on Jewish laws, and think of every possibility. So if your donkey falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to engage in the work of pulling your donkey out, but you got to provide your donkey a pillow. I kid you not, that is a law. So, okay, but that's the idea that even the animals get to rest. So the next piece of that is the seventh year. So the seventh year, all land lies fallow, right? So it's rest for the earth. But as I said, it really is an indigenous land-based people's tradition. They understood that the land is not inexhaustible, that the land has to rest. And if you look, sometimes you can tell the importance of something by the consequences of not observing it, right? So there are two things that you get thrown out of the land of Israel for: idolatry and not observing the seventh year. So not observing the seventh year, if we look in the prophets, it's among the most heinous of all crimes, is not observing the seventh year. You get vomited out of the land, I think, in Jeremiah. So it's a very serious thing, and from the historical record, we know that it was observed for hundreds of years, because there are references in the book of Maccabees to a siege. There are references from other books you can see from historians. We know that the Romans said that acceded to the request to not have to pay, the Jews did not have to pay taxes in the seventh year because they didn't have crops. So from archaeological records, historical records, we actually know that for hundreds of years, the 7th year was observed that the land was allowed to lie fallow. And not only the land to lie fallow, but it was communal. You were supposed to take your fences down, and if you had a fig tree growing in your yard, those figs did not belong to you. They were totally communal property. So in the 7th year, the commons was completely venerated. So everybody shared the commons. There was no such thing as private landed property in that 7th year. Right? Everything is communal. So far that the laws state that once the tree stops bearing figs, and I am the owner of that fig tree, if I kept a bushel of figs, I have to give it away. I am not allowed to keep that bushel of figs that grew in the 7th year, even though it grew on my land. I am bound, I have to bring it to the market and give it away, or give it to the court for them to give it away. So accumulation of private property is not even allowed in that 7th year. And then all debt is forgiven. So one of the wisdoms of the biblical tradition that actually is only honored today by Muslims is forbidding interest. So interest is interest is the basis of a competitive society. Because if I borrow $10 and I have to pay back 12, that means I have to make money off of somebody else. Right? Once you charge interest, it's competition. So the Hebrew Bible understood that interest undermines a sense of community. Once you start charging other people in your community interest, you are no longer having each other's interest in mind. You are into your own self-interest. So interest, the charging of interest is the undermining of a sense of community. So,
and at the same time, some of that Herman Daly was right that also is left behind growth-based economics.
yes. Right, so growth-based economics, which we know is destroying the planet, is based on interest. Because if I have to pay you back $12 for my borrowed 10, something's got to grow. It's once you have to pay interest back, it leads to it's based on the principle of infinite resources, right? Interest is based on infinite development and infinite resources and competition. So we need to think of ways of having an economic system that does without interest, and it is possible. So the laws of Jubilee economics really are instructive in terms of a liberation theology of the land resting, people resting, the elimination of debt. And then, one second, John, and then comes the big one, the coup de grace, which we have no evidence actually that it was ever enacted, which is that every 50 years is a redistribution of wealth, that everybody gets a similar amount. The understanding that through accident, through disease, through happenstance, inequality will emerge. And to deal with that inequality, we need to have a structure that takes it in place. That accounts for it. So what Jubilee economics tells us is there have to be structural corrections that consistently bring a society back to equality. John?
I just wanted a clarification that the forgiveness of debt was every 7 years.
Every 70 years. And every 50 years, in the 50th year, there's no debt, and all land gets returned, etc.
Do people practice the 70-year thing?
That's an interesting question. So in the progressive Jewish environmental world of the last 8 or 10 years, people are having conversations, what would it mean to practice the seventh year now? And what does it mean to create communities where that happens? So I would say on the fringes of the progressive Jewish community, there are conversations about what that would mean. And in Israel, there are conversations at different levels of people about what would it mean to practice the seventh year. And some of the kibbutzim, the collective farms, do practice the seventh year. Among the ultra-religious people in Israel, they do practice the seventh year in a way. They will not eat produce grown in Israel in that seventh year. So if it's grown someplace, it's a whole, they have, right. So it's observed in that way.
Land is fallow.
And there have been attempts by progressive folks in Israel so the last time there was a seventh year, it still counted, it was 3 years ago, I believe. So somebody introduced a bill that the admission to all of the parks in the country were free that year. And there was some level of debt forgiveness. I forget exactly how, but there was actually some across the board debt forgiveness. And some other things happened. So there are people trying to come to grips with what it would mean in this world. Yeah.
And I want to add, like in the United States, on your credit reports, like negative things are eliminated from your credit score after 7 years, which is interesting. Bankruptcy. No, it's
right. It's a vestige of the seventh year. Yeah.
Professors have sabbaticals.
Professors have sabbaticals.
That's what they call that. Credit card companies are like, this is all pretty shitty, but I'm gonna give you a solid.
And if you do bankruptcy or whatever, enter into whatever. Is that right?
Right. So those set of economic relationships that are outlined, in the Torah, which are real. So I did some research into this. So it turned out that in the pre-biblical society in Mesopotamia, they used to forgive all debts when they were afraid of revolt. Exactly. It was actually a conservative measure. What happened was, when you have an agricultural society, particularly, well, even still, agricultural societies rely on debt. You borrow money in the spring to buy seeds, to plant. You plant your seeds. You repay the debt in the fall. You borrow money again, and indebtedness arose. And when too much indebtedness arises, you have social unrest. So it used to be the custom when a new king was anointed in Mesopotamia, all debts were forgiven. So they have found that written on markers from 3,000 years ago, right? So we know that when kings were installed, the debts were forgiven. And then people found that it started happening more often, not just when the king was installed, and that one of the reasons, and the reason was to prevent social unrest. Debt was forgiven. So that's where the Hebrews got that practice from, to trying to prevent people from becoming indebted. So if we want to think of a miracle at Sinai, the miracle is the idea that people would come together and form a society based on justice. Great. Will, since you teach this stuff, is there anything you want to add?
In those same texts, you have all these extreme descriptions of the Ark of the Covenant. It goes into great detail about the size of it, whatnot, and some scholars try to sketch, okay, what are they actually describing here? And some people put, it's a throne, and no one's on it. And as Jesus will use the phrase later, it really is a reign of God. God's in charge, and if we truly believe not Pharaoh or no, Macedonian king or Nebuchadnezzar, not a person, but the nameless God, the God who can be captured in a name or an image, the radically free God, is we say this is the year, and therefore, ideally, we are all equal, and that begins the glue of community, and it is a principle upon which a lot of these economic teachings. We're a community. We're equal. We're all, we have our holy God. We don't need it. So that it gets complicated later, of course.
Thanks, Will. Anybody else want to add anything about reflections, ideas about how this Jubilee economics could be useful in terms of political work, your justice work, your ideas of liberation?
Let me say first, I think this is really important. I don't know if people know this history, but the emergence of the Jubilee notion in biblical scholarship took root among some British Christians, primarily back in the 80s, I think. They began gathering and raised this issue of global debt. And they made the outrageous claim that we should actually start a movement to release poor nations from global debt, which when first raised was like, yeah, right, we're going to get our women yacht. Come on, just be real. It just wasn't thinkable. But I don't even know the story of how that came to work, but within 5-10 years, the idea of global debt relief was taken very seriously, even by the IMF, even by Senator Jesse Helms. So there's a case where some folks seized on this biblical traditions, made a direct corollary. The reason that this doesn't happen. And so let's apply it.
Something I was going to say, maybe it's just so obvious it didn't have to be said, but this morning we heard Carmela, the sanctuary, the idea of sanctuary also comes from the Bible. So I don't remember exactly the details on that, but
Sanctuary cities.
Yeah, but it also isn't it start even with the king story?
Right, but that's for sanctuary cities.
Anyway, it's part of the whole biblical what you're talking about,
Right.
the ideas of justice and forgiveness somehow finding its way into that vision.
Yes.
I just want to pick up on what Will said. In Canada, the way we actually took that, it was further. We actually had a 3-year program about, kind of liberating from oppression and redistribution of wealth and restoring the earth. So we kind of made it like a 3-year. Obviously, it should be a permanent thing, but it was kind of an interesting thing. We tried to take it beyond debt, saying it wasn't just about debt; it was also about equal liberation and redistribution of wealth as well, and
I don't know if this is related, but with Jubilee economics, okay. So I live in a part of the Bronx that is historically Jewish, and so in my community, my next door neighbor is but he's Orthodox. So in my community, a person who belongs to the synagogue in that community can apply, and they will be relieved for a year. They won't have to pay rent. The community supports them to relocate to that community, to my community where I live. Is that related to Jubilee economics?
No, that has to do with supporting Torah scholars, supporting people who want to study Torah or study Jewish law, being supported by the rest of the community. It's the value of supporting people who want to learn. It's a whole other. Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I'm hearing you raise up goes with something else I've been hearing recently, is kind of an invitation for people of faith to feel like it's legitimate to question economics.
Yeah.
That a lot of people in the community go, well, the economics is up to the I don't know enough, or like we can stand up, we can protest war. We don't feel like we have to be a military experts to do that, but to protest the economy is like, that's not the same, taken the same way, right? And so I think what I'm hearing from you is an invitation to question
Yes.
and to challenge and to feel like
Yes.
that we need to know how we feel about these things
Yes.
and speak up for them.
Capitalism is not the only economic system. And we are trained to believe that it's got to be capitalism, and we can question it and challenge it, and there are alternatives to it, and hopefully a liberation theology has to be not only about political liberation, but about economic liberation, and it's the system that's got to be challenged that works together. We can't see their expertise to anything.
Well, someone is always oppressed in a capitalist system.
Right.
Because it's somebody else's oppression which makes it more like possible.
Right.
And it's
Always.
more fragile than we think. I remember Jake Swartland from Botswana at a big gathering at the World Bank. He stood up and he said, if I could show that my country's debt is directly a reaction, a consequence of your failed recommendations forced upon us by this thing, can I take you to court for that? And George Sakaropoulos was there. He was off stage. There were 3 people on stage. We didn't even know he was in the building. He walks on stage, tells them to leave, says to everybody, thank you very much for coming, there's food in the back, and they shut it down. Bam. And I remember that I was so impressed by that, I thought, they are terrified.
Yeah.
They are terrified that somebody will actually stand up and say, you guys are to blame here.
Right.
And it's that, yeah, that's terrible.
And they are.
And that's how fragile it is. Like, it wouldn't, sometimes it doesn't take a lot of pushing to throw along.
Jose?
I had a question, and I sort of have an answer for it, but I thought that somebody who's better at talking to God would have a better answer than me. I just can't wrap my brain around how what we learned this morning, what we're talking about now, are things that happen here, happen in seminaries and in academic discussions, but not in churches across the country. For the most part, we live in a country with unbelievable wealth disparities, people warehousing prisons as a solution to every single problem, and I can keep on going, but it's like, and I'm not attacking myself for this, but I too sat in pews of churches that read the Bible and didn't do shit about anything. And like, we come from poverty and working class, so we're not, got Benzes, but I don't understand why this has been around for 2,000 years and we are where we are, and we're not even talking about it in a serious way.
So what's your answer to the question?
We gotta start talking about it.
I guess my answer would be that we like to commune with this idea that we've created that God is with a handful of scriptures that don't ask us to do anything of consequence.
Joe, say it loud.
Speak up. I feel like as soon as you said that, what came to me when you talked about we sit here and we talk about it, but we don't talk about it in churches and whatever, it's still this hierarchy that exists where here we have some better understanding, we're smarter, we're something, but the layperson can't understand it, they can't get it, they whatever. And that breeds it breeds even more of an imbalance.
Yeah.
Well, it's not necessarily what I was saying. I was saying that we have so many churches, but we have all these problems.
Yes, but you said that, yes, but to me, what I'm hearing also, even with you saying that, is we're talking about it in a way here that is not talked about in a way in churches.
Yeah.
So what's the point in us sitting here, we having these meaningful, very deep discussions, but in Sunday school, all we hear is John 3:16 and these very specific quotes. We're not taught, we don't entrust the people that they can understand.
Well, that was the basis of liberation theology, was for the people to interpret it.
No, the people are smart enough, and the people are from the earth, the people, we understand it, they probably understand it and have more solutions than we do. Because we're stuck in academic spaces where they've lived it, their ancestors have lived it, and it's been brought to them generation after generation, where we are in academia trying to find a solution. You can't find solutions when you created the problem. It's people academia
But I think that's the
created the
thing, they're not
problem.
acknowledging the fact that they created the problem.
So that, there we go.
There we go.
John, you got your hand up.
I was going to say that we heard perfectly why that is the case, in that Scripture has been compartmentalized, it has been interpreted by those in power, which are the wealthy, and that interpretation of the Scriptures, which we heard today just in those two passages of the widow's mite and the talents, it just oppresses the poor rather than liberates them. And it's that interpretation that the wealthy and the powers have inculcated on the entire Western tradition that keeps everybody, and that's what's in the churches, because that's the approved interpretation of those scriptures.
Ron, you got your hand up?
Yeah, in response to Jose's question, why do we talk one way here and we don't talk this way somewhere else? Maybe it is because we stay in the realm of talk. And if the divine is, essence of the divine is possibility of possibilities, it's the faith that, the action, like Lena was saying, that shows, and maybe I need to be more of a burning bush. Frankel says, the one who would be light must endure the burning. And so, if I'm willing to do that, the Jubilee becomes not a discussion like we're having right now, because I don't feel like dancing or celebrating. A Jubilee is a dance. It's a celebration. It's a happiness. And I'm not doing enough Jubilee economics in my own practice to want to dance about it. But if I was, somebody would say, what's that guy doing? It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. He looks like he's drunk. And there would be conversation in the church, I think.
So I may be wrong, but what I thought I heard was that there are people in churches who know this. And what are we doing? What I'm asking, what are we doing to make sure we're supporting them, believing them? And that's different from the mega churches that have all the money. But how many of us are involved in communities where the people in the churches do know and have some ideas, but don't feel like they're heard or believed?
Well, some of the organizations that Ralph funds do that.
Yes.
You know? So the number of interfaith networks, whether it's Faith in Action or IAF or DART, you know, those are organizations that are working with people in churches and synagogues and mosques that are doing that. We do, thanks to Ralph's organization, they're getting some money, but those organizations do exist and we need to support them.
That's right.
Absolutely. I mean, there are people out there doing the work.
I also wanted to say that I think that churches are a power structure. And so when we go to those churches, and myself included, and we're silent, we are saying that we're fine with the power structure. And the moment you no longer hold your silence and you start to question that, and you disrupt that system, you're not welcome, basically. I mean that's the reality. So I think that I actually would say that I think part of our silence and our inaction is our fear of what we're going to lose, because the moment we are going to lose, I mean, there's just no getting around it. You are going to lose. When you disrupt the system and you say this is not okay anymore and it has to be different, and you challenge the power system and you say like, I'm not going to abide by this power system anymore and you can't make me, you have lost.
That's exactly what Jesus was saying in the parables.
And I think there's fear of that, and like, yeah.
Francisco, before I call on you, I want to pick up on that.
Yeah.
I think that is a really, really important point. It's the fear of what I'm going to lose that really keeps people in place. So there are a bunch of psychological studies that show that fear of losing something is way more of a predictor or determinant of action than the possibility of gain. The fear of loss is a much stronger motivator than the possibility of gain in human psychology. So one of the things that people of faith need to do is talk about having that faith when you might lose something. When I've been doing work in the last while with some synagogues around racism and white privilege, and the issue I come to see is people's fear of loss, and it's inchoate. It's not like it's just like it's inchoate fear of what am I going to lose if I give this up? What does it mean? So the work of faith in many ways is helping people deal with the fear of loss and change. And what is it that you think you're going to lose, right, in a world that's more equal, or a world that you're giving something up? And that I think is such a cutting edge place, especially in white churches, white synagogues, that's not so much in communities of color, but certainly in white spaces, that fear of loss is a really important place. Francisco?
Well, as Quaker said, you just spoke my mind. But I wanted to add the importance of creating a space for this conversation to happen is unique. You know, here we are. Over the weekend we will be a total of around 50 something people participating on this experience. So this type of conversation, we cannot hide it. We need to take it to our different places and, ignite, encender, ¿verdad? Create the fire that we are creating here, because it is important. It is important. It's not that the text is old or new. It's that the knowledge the wisdom that we are creating here is bigger than us. And yes, we are able to carry it. Yeah? So, just wanted to add that. Thanks.
So the one other thing I want to talk about a little bit is the whole question that I started earlier, which is the universal particular question, is how do we hold up the rights of the group? I say universal particular, what I'm meaning in this particular case is individual rights and group rights. So we live in a country that is, at least in theory, based on individual rights. So the myth of American politics, or the political system, is the philosopher John Locke saying autonomous individuals came together to form a society. They voluntarily gave up their freedom, their rights to pull together to create a larger society for the well-being and safety of all. That's such a crock of shit. There has never, ever been an individual society. There was no person ever lived individually. He made up this story about individual rights, and now we have this myth that it's the individual that is the basis of society. That's never been true. When has any individual person been able to survive on her or his own? You can't. It wasn't that people came together and voluntarily gave up their rights. They started out together. And they could only live by being together. So we really need to honor what the needs of the group are. At the same time, we also need to respect the rights of the individual. Right? So individual rights came about in the Enlightenment because of the oppressive nature on some level of medieval society that didn't allow for individual freedom. So we've moved all the way in the direction of individual freedom and forgot about the needs of the commons, of the collectivity, of the whole. We don't have very good models of balancing the two. Right? The idea of reparations in this country to people who were enslaved or reparations to indigenous people, that really depends on understanding that there's such a thing as group rights. That something is done to a group of people, and a group of people has there is a vested set of rights and responsibilities towards the group, and that balancing those two pieces has been a very difficult thing in this country. And nobody else has got it right either, so it's not like in this country, right? Nobody else has really got that right. But the challenge for us in liberation theology is in part, how do we affirm that both? How do we affirm that we are in a multi-faith spectrum, that each faith is has its right, has its needs, each group has its rights, and that the individual has its rights at the same time. And there's certainly a tension there, especially when we feel that some groups oppress the people within them, right? Right? So if we think that there's a religious group that is really oppressing women or oppressing queer people, then we don't want that to happen. So we want to be able to protect the rights of that individual. At the same time, we want groups to have relative autonomy, to have their own cultural ways and understand their rights. That is a tension that we have not really explored a lot. And it's a tension that I think, going back to where I started with it, the meta story can hold in some way. We have to be able to hold a story that is a sacred story that really understands that we need the different cultures of the society to produce a healthy society, at the same time as we need the rights of the individual to have a healthy society. So I'm just throwing that open in terms of what theological or religious understanding would help you hold that?
Do you have an answer?
No. I really believe that we are a moment of collective trying to figure things out. I don't have an answer, no. I think that's a tension that exists in our society that we don't look at. And we need to. And I'm asking how your theological, your understanding of God, your relationship to God, or your religious understandings will help you hold that.
So I think that my most lived experience of that, I went to a Quaker college, and my most lived experience of that was in the classroom, where we were really taught that in order to come to truth, the Quaker principle, in order to come to truth, we had to hear from everyone in the collective. And that meant leaving longer pauses so people who were shyer or who were introverts would have time to speak. And there was really there was a deep ethos that we needed to hear from everyone or we were going to miss part of the truth. And it was the responsibility of the collective to make sure that all the individuals were heard from. How that then works to, it was certainly more challenging in terms of politics of identity and how the different groups on campus got heard from. I mean, it works within a small setting, within individuals within one collective. But I don't know, there was definitely a tendency towards hierarchy of suffering of different groups of oppression and how that got coded and whose stories got to be told. And, so it didn't do so well on the group level.
You wouldn't believe how many rabbis have Quaker backgrounds.
Easily 25% of the people who attend the Brooklyn meeting are from a Jewish background. 25%.
I have a flea market theology, and I don't know where to find it in the text, But in the flea market, nobody owns the land, everybody gets the identical 15 by 20 foot slot, identical tables, and whatever happens within your slot happens, it happens right next to the next one, and next to the next one, and the next one. You have to forfeit the mall theology, where everything's temperature controlled, and you know, about, there's policies about refunds and stuff. Flea market, you don't know if somebody's going to be back again or not, you don't know the quality of stuff, you don't know how much it's going to cost. There's no policy about quality of refunds or anything, but I want to live in the flea market, theologically.
What if somebody is selling anti-Semitic or racist paraphernalia on their table? Then what do you do? I mean, I think that's the question
I don't have a problem with that because I stand next to that, and if the divine that is, it will, a bush will burn, and it will burn up everything around it, or whatever is not real will not burn. So there's a competition that's lively and fluid, and truth will be true.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So earlier you were talking about that, I thought I understood a comment you made earlier today about that being a burning bush being about action. That's how I understood you earlier today. Could you clarify the action that you're talking about in that example?
In the flea market, my action is what I do in my space that I have for 8 hours.
Right, so that's a very individual interpretation. It's not, that doesn't take into account the commons.
Right.
It's not a collective
But the flea market
understanding.
itself, it is a market. It's a marketplace.
It's a market, but the marketplace is not a paradigm for a society that works collectively. It's a paradigm for a society working competitively and not taking care of the commons. So I'm looking at the time. So I want you to. I really don't have an answer to that question. I just threw it out because I think that people. I think we need to think about it. I think that those of us who want to think about what a theology needs to do and what liberation means needs to think about that tension. But what I want to do in closing. So the Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday night. And one of the blessings that we say over the wine on Friday night is remembering the experience of leaving Egypt. Okay? So I'd like you to turn to a partner, and I'll tell you what the question is. The question is, since it's about the experience of freedom, share with your partner some experience that you've had recently, hopefully it's recently, of an experience of freedom, thinking out of the box, finishing a difficult task, going through a difficult experience, some experience that you've had of that moment of freedom, that moment of exhilaration, that moment of being free of something, because going into the Sabbath is about that taste of freedom. So remember a moment, tell your partner about a moment you had where you experienced that taste of freedom, being out of the box, getting rid of a difficult thing. And the first, you'll have 2 minutes each, and the first person please begin. Thank you, partner. And go into the Sabbath with that feeling of freedom. Shalom.